So as I said already, folks, that this is one of Ulster Wildlife's online winter talks about the wildlife of our peatlands, hosted by myself, Simon Gray, and Roisin Donnelly. And just to go over some of the bits of housekeeping here while some more people are coming in and joining in. And the talk is going to be about 30 minutes, probably a little bit longer than 30 minutes, I'm not going to lie, and may well ramble a bit more than that. And then we'll have maybe about 20, 30 minutes for questions afterwards. Just to warn everybody, the talk is being recorded, and that means that we can then share it with other registrants and other Ulster Wildlife members after the talk. It gets put up on YouTube afterwards, so that you can listen to it over and over and over again if you really want. If you could keep your video switched off, if you do not wish to be recorded, that would be great. And if you could also just keep your microphone muted during the talk, that would also be great. It just means that we don't get any feedback or anything during it. So that would be brilliant. And during the whole talk, please feel free to ask questions using the chat facility. So you'll see the chat button down at the bottom. If you want to ask any questions, just throw them in there. And we'll maybe take a couple of moments through the talk and definitely at the end to go through all of those questions. So yeah, feel free. If there's anything you want to ask, just throw it in there and we'll come to it towards the end then. Great. Okay, so this is for members and non-members. So thank you very much to everybody for coming, both members and non-members alike. And thank you very much to the members in particular for continuing to support the efforts of Ulster Wildlife. It's really, really appreciated. And it means that we can do all the wonderful work that we do for Northern Ireland wildlife. And you get to listen to agents like ourselves go on about stuff that we love. So without further ado then, we'll start going over some of the peatland wildlife stuff. So peatland wildlife is quite a broad thing, like all wildlife, to be honest. This is a picture of Cuckoo Mountain, which has been used to death in mine and Roisin's presentations. But it's pretty indicative of peatland habitats across Northern Ireland. So this is some really good blanket bog, but it's not the only kind of habitat or the only kind of peatland that we get. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through what makes peatlands sort of special and what wildlife has to deal with on peatlands. But also the different types of peatland habitats that we have across Northern Ireland. And I'm going to go through the different kind of groups of peatland wildlife, so birds, insects, and other different species that we find within these habitats. So what are peatlands and where are they? So peatlands include blanket bogs and heathlands, and raised bogs and fens. And all of those habitats there actually cover about 12% of Northern Ireland's land. So pretty big chunk of the ground in this wee country. Blanket bogs and heathlands are in our upland areas. So if you think about places like the Belfast Hills up on Divis there and Black Mountain, the Antrim Hills up around sort of Troston and the Glens and Slieve and Ora, and the Mourns, very well known, the Sperrins and also places like West Fermanagh. Those are our kind of upland blanket bog and heathland areas. And then the raised bogs, kind of contrary to what you would think whenever you think about it, raised bogs are in the lowlands. So they tend to be in sort of valleys and very flat floodplain areas. So you think about places like the Bann Valley or Lough Neagh, particularly down around that southwest corner of Lough Neagh. And then in and around places like Omagh and the Ferrywater Valley, which has lots and lots of lowland peatlands, and a really important area in Northern Ireland for those lowland raised bogs. And then where we don't have so many lowland raised bogs in Northern Ireland, but we have a lot more fens, is in County Down. So if you think particularly the area around the likes of the Coyle, kind of Downpatrick and the Lakeal area, there's a lot of very important fen habitats in there. And peatlands and blanket bogs are blanket bogs and lowland raised bogs are fed purely by rainfall, whereas fens are fed by groundwater. So that makes them slightly different to the other to raised bog and blanket bogs. And when I'm talking about wildlife, I'm probably going to focus a bit more about blanket bogs and raised bog wildlife than fens, because fens have a lot of wildlife on them. So I'll be here all night if we're going to talk about as much of them. So that gives you a bit of background of peatland habitats, what they are and where they are. So as I said, blanket bogs That's Cuckoo Mountain there, one of the biggest areas of blanket bog in Northern Ireland, second only to the Garran Plateau. Lowland raised bogs like Peatlands Park here, that's Mulnakill National Nature Reserve, looking out towards Lough Neagh there. Really, really important lowland raised bog habitat in our wee country. And then fens like this one in the Lakeal Fens. This is Corbally, just outside Downpatrick. So very, very different look there between the likes of Peatlands Park and Corbally. There you can tell very different places. So peatlands, not exactly the easiest places to survive. They are extremely wet. They get a lot of rainfall, particularly in blanket bogs. And wildlife can find it very challenging living in very wet conditions, particularly in this part of the world where it can get quite cold and wet. They're often very exposed and open, so they can be very, very windy, which again makes it quite difficult to survive. And more importantly, when it comes to the plants that survive in peatlands, they're really low in nutrients, and the soils, the peatland soil is very acidic, so that can make it quite of a struggle for plant species to survive. So yeah, they're not the handiest places to live in, but there's quite a lot of different species that have managed to evolve in order to actually survive in these places. So we'll start off with the birds, and some of the rarest and most iconic birds are found on peatlands. They mostly nest on the ground and in the open, which really is a really terrible strategy if you're trying to survive. Makes them very, very vulnerable. And actually some of the birds that have seen the most stark declines in recent years are birds of these kind of open peatland habitats. But they're also some of the most really beautiful and evocative songs, and some of our really most iconic species that we get on peatlands. We'll go through some of those in a minute. Many of them are under threat, as I've already mentioned there. So quite a few of these species have seen really dramatic declines in their population over the past, particularly maybe 30, 40 years. And just to start off with the pigeon of the bog, which is the meadow pipit here, who is probably the most common bird species that you will find on any bogs, both lowland or uplands. If you are walking any kind of peatland habitat, whether it's up in the hills and the moorns or something, or around Peatlands Park, for example, and you see a little brown bird flitting around between bits of heather, it is more than likely a meadow pipit. They're very common, and that makes them quite a preferred candidate for another very iconic bird species that we get in these parts of the world as well. We'll touch on it a wee bit later. I call them mippets, and you sometimes see them parachuting down from the sky, singing their little display song. Nice little bird. A much more iconic bird is golden plover. So this is a really rare bird in Northern Ireland, and specifically found in our kind of northern and western wet blanket bogs. So the two remaining areas that have breeding populations in them, and it's only when they're breeding when they have these black bibs and white coloration with the golden speckles on the back, which gives them their name. Pedigo Plateau and Cuckoo Mountain in Fermanagh are the only two areas really left where we have breeding golden plover, and they've seen massive declines for a whole host of different reasons. And one of the biggest is likely to be climate change. So it could well be that they're being pushed further and further north, and actually this part of Northern Ireland is just at the edge of their range, and as temperatures increase, then we may well just see golden plover disappear, which would be a real shame, because the really sort of haunting call is particularly linked to upland landscapes, blanket bogs in particular. So a really nice bird, one that would be a real shame to see disappear over the next wee while. Skylark is very well-known bird, and sort of put on a pedestal by poets and artists alike for a long, long time for its song. It is one of the longest singing birds that we can hear in Northern Ireland. In fact, actually, skylarks can sing for 11 minutes straight without taking a break, without splitting at all. And that's because they really utilize the vocal organ that birds have, which is different to ours. We have a larynx, whereas birds have a syrinx. And a syrinx actually means that birds can breathe and sing at the same time, which if you try to do right now, you'll quickly find out just makes you sound like an idiot. But birds can do it really, really handily. And this means that a skylark can fly straight up into the air as high as it possibly can, right over the center of its territory. and it continued to sing and actually breathe the whole time for about 10 minutes straight, which is really impressive. But the song is just amazing. It's such a symbolic sound of summer when you're out on these kind of habitats, and do get them on grasslands and other areas, but they're really widespread on places like blanket bogs and lowland raised bogs. And they're fairly partial to the odd crane fly, as you can see from this photograph. And then another very iconic bird that we get in our uplands is the hen harrier. And hen harriers are really beautiful raptors. The males actually very regularly mistaken for seagulls from a distance, because in the bottom left-hand photograph there, you can see a very pale, sort of like a blue-gray, almost virgin on sort of silvery color, with black wingtips. So from a distance, you can very often think that they're a seagull until you kind of get tuned into the way they fly. They fly very low to the ground and tend to sort of swoop back and forth, quartering areas looking for prey. And the females look a bit more like what a lot of people probably recognize as a buzzard, but slightly different, slightly more slender. And one of the real key features that you notice whenever you see them flying away is this white rump just at the head of the tail. But they're unfortunately widely persecuted birds in many parts of the UK and Ireland because they often come into conflict with game birds. Thankfully in Northern Ireland, because sort of things like grouse shooting aren't anywhere near as widespread as they are in places like Scotland and England, then we actually have a reasonable population of hen harriers, particularly in areas like the Antrim Hills, West Fermanagh, and in around Slieve Bay. They're really, really amazing birds, and they particularly like feeding on meadow pipits. And they're a really distinctive flight, and they actually have this amazing thing that they do roundabout right now, actually called sky dancing, where the females and the males do this display flight to each other, where they fly right up in the air and they twist and turn, and they actually throw food between one another. So the female or the male will actually have something like a meadow pipit or a small mammal in its talons, and it will fly away up, and the female will fly directly underneath, and the male will throw that item of prey to the female in midair, and the female will catch it. And this is all part of their sort of bonding ritual before they actually breed. But they again are really, really vulnerable to predation, and particularly to fires. They nest on the ground, which is unusual for a bird of prey. So they fairly regularly succumb to their nests being burnt with the increasing number of fires that we're seeing in upland areas in particular over recent years. But a really nice bird. I'm very, very lucky if you see one. So yeah, very nice indeed. And snipe are a bird that you will probably more likely to hear than see in many occasions. So if you do see them, then you're probably in the wintertime walking across a bit of bog, and you flush them, and they sort of appear out of nowhere, and you can nearly be standing on them before they fly away. And they'll do this thing where they zigzag back and forth, and they say snatch, 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 and then they disappear and drop into the heather in the distance. But these are a bird that have become much more uncommon in recent years. And you might hear them at night, actually, or at sunset, where they do this thing called drumming, where they actually sort of, they wiggle their tail feathers together, and it creates this weird, almost humming noise. And that's one of the reasons why they colloquially got called the weather bleat in the past. So if anybody remembers something called the weather bleat, that's what they are. They're snipe. And yeah, I more regularly come across them by literally standing on them out on the bog. Thankfully, I've never actually stood on one. A red grouse, very iconic species of our uplands. Strangely enough, actually, red grouse would have usually also be found in lowland raised bogs, but they've almost completely gone from those areas, and now they're really only restricted to the uplands. And if you go into areas of Northern England or in Scotland, these birds are very, very common, but in Northern Ireland, they're actually a lot less common. Do have reasonable numbers of them in places like the Antrim Hills and in Fermanagh and some parts of the Sperrins. But other than that, they're quite restricted. And that's because we don't manage the land specifically for them, and we don't control predators to the same sort of level that they would in those other areas. But really iconic with that red wattle above the male's eye. And you'll more often than not actually hear them before you would see them, where the males will make that go back, go back, go back, go back, go back noise away off in the distance when you're out in the hill. Wheat ears really nice migrant bird that we get this time of year. And the males are this beautiful sort of stone grey kind of bluey colour. And they actually come all the way from Africa. And we see them very often in very rocky kind of upland areas. So the Mourns is very good for them, but any kind of upland kind of blanket bog area is usually quite good for wheat ears at this time of year. So keep an eye out at the minute, because this is the sort of time where they're starting to arrive. And stone chats, another absolutely beautiful little songbird, sort of similar in size to a robin, and actually quite similar in sort of form and everything. They're very closely related. And best way to recognize a stone chat actually is the noise that they make. So the reason they get their name is because they sound like banging two pebbles together. And it's complete. It's uncanny. The noise is exactly like that. It's really, really incredible. But you often see these little birds sitting on top of some little bit of vegetation, and they sit there and then they fly off and they grab a little insect and then they fly back. And every time they make that little noise of banging the stones together, then they sort of waggle their tail a little bit. They have a really distinctive flight, but very common bird in both lowland raised bogs and uplands, blanket bogs and heathlands as well. A really nice coloration at this time of year when they get that black cap and this russet kind of breast. And finally then on the bird front, probably the most iconic bird that we get is the cuckoo. And unfortunately for the meadow pipit succumbs to the cuckoo's ploy fairly regularly. Being one of the more common birds in these kind of habitats, the cuckoo really does take advantage of them. And these birds, they fly all the way from Central Africa. So a lot of them spend the winter in the Congo, and they fly right across the Sahara, all the way over the Mediterranean, right across continental Europe, and then land with us and spend their summer, the early spring and summer, taking advantage of small birds and eating all of our hairy caterpillars. And you actually fairly regularly mistake them for a bird of prey. And this is actually quite an interesting kind of technique that they use. So they look very like a sparrowhawk. And one of the reasons behind this is because if you're a meadow pipit or any kind of ground nesting bird and you see a sparrowhawk, one of the first things you'll do is that you'll leave your nest and you fly away off to distract the sparrowhawk from your chicks. But this is great if it's a sparrowhawk. If it's a cuckoo, it's exactly the last thing that you would ever want to do, because as soon as you leave the nest, the cuckoo goes, oh, great, nest is empty. I'm going to go over to the nest, kick out your eggs, lay mine, job's a good one. So it's incredible how that's actually evolved. So it's evolved to look like a bird of prey because of the actions that other birds will take when they see birds of prey. So really interesting kind of evolutionary relationship there. On to the butterflies and the bugs and the beasts of the bogs. So some of our most important and priority species in Northern Ireland are found in peatlands when it comes to particularly insects and butterflies and moths. Several are only found on peatlands because of the low nutrient levels and are highly adapted to those sorts of areas. And many of these are at risk due to habitat loss, improvement and fragmentation. So quite a few of them, things like improvement of the land, seeing them disappear at quite a rate. So to start off, we'll mention the large heath, which is a really sort of an Irish specialist. We have good population of large heath butterfly here, and it is very heavily linked with lowland raised bogs in particular, because the caterpillars of large heath feed on hairstreak cotton grass, which really only kind of grows in these acidic peatland habitats. This is my dirty, mucky old finger that you can see one sitting on there on Balmahone Bog. And really nice butterflies. You kind of see them, they're very closely related to and look very similar to small heath butterflies. But whereas you get small heath butterflies in grasslands and dune systems and all sorts of other places, you will really only get large heath butterflies in these peatland habitats. And they're bigger, but not massively bigger. But the way I kind of distinguish between them is that large heath almost looks a bit dopey when it flies around. It almost has this sort of slow, flappy kind of flight. And they never open their wings. They always sit with their wings closed. But a really nice species and a real Northern Ireland peatland specialist that we're quite proud to have here. And then a few other things on the Lepidoptera front. So green hairstreak is an amazingly vibrant green butterfly that we get, particularly around the edges of our bogs. So the green coloration of its wings there is actually an adaptation to look very similar to fresh birch leaves whenever they first come out at springtime. So although it looks amazing, it's actually an adaptation in order to camouflage. And if it sits on a birch tree at about sort of April, May time, it's very hard to spot them. And they're really small, actually. They're really quite tiny, but amazingly beautiful if you can get a good look at them. And then also emperor moths. These moths, they're pretty big, a few inches across, and they're the only species of moth that we have here that's part of the silkworm family. So the same worms that are used out in India to produce silk, they're actually very closely related to these emperor moths. And that's the female moth there after it's emerged. Really amazing eye spots on it, which it uses to sort of scare predators whenever it opens its wings. And then this crazy green thing is the caterpillar that you sometimes come across, which feeds on heather out on bogs, and looks like a cactus, to be honest. And it would really hurt if you wanted to pick it up. And that is, again, another adaptation to stop things like cuckoos eating them, which they often try and do. And then a real Irish specialist, a Northern Irish specialist here actually, is the Marsh fritillary, a butterfly which is very, very rare even across the whole of Europe. But we are quite lucky to have good populations of it here. And it's a species which is found quite regularly around the edges of bogs, where you get a bit more of a grassland kind of habitat interspersed with bogs. And then in some upland areas where you get bits of blanket bog mixed in with bits of grassland. And it's a very fussy butterfly, and its caterpillars are very, very fussy as well. They're strange because they actually form these weird balls of snot called webs, where they sort of commune together. And you can see the picture on the left-hand side there, the tiny little caterpillars within this thing that looks like, I don't know, if you're very dehydrated and were to spit on the ground. It's quite an odd adaptation, but basically it keeps them all together, and they wrap around their food plant, which is the devil's bit scabious, which we find in these sort of habitats. But a really nice adult butterfly that it turns into this sort of stained glass window, orangey, pale yellow kind of coloration. And yeah, it's one of the nicest species that you can see in these sorts of habitats. And then dragonflies and damselflies are real iconic species that we find on some of our peatlands, particularly the lowland raised bogs. And they're very heavily associated with the kind of pools and even blocked drains that we have on many of our peatlands now. And the more common species would be things like the large red damselfly, which will probably be coming out in the next sort of couple of months. And the four-spotted chaser, one of the first dragonflies to emerge, so-called, as you can see there, because it has 8 spots technically because it has 4 wings, but that's just being picky. So it has 4 spots on each side on the wings. And then slightly less common, the common, strangely enough, even though it has the name, common hawker, which is quite a big dragonfly. And you'll see them sort of zooming up and down drainage features or up and down sort of linear features on bogs, looking for unwitting crane flies and daddy longlegs to eat. And even rarer again then, we get it in more areas out in the west of Northern Ireland, the black darter, really, really nice dragonfly. The males have this dark black coloration with these patches of yellow on it. And they really are specifically found in many areas of bog pools, where the larvae really actually only like that very acidic water, and they're specifically adapted to survive in those areas. But dragonflies and damselflies, they're the real aerial predators within a lot of these peatland environments, and they in turn then feed a lot of the birds that we get in these sorts of areas. But they're amazing to see when you come across them, especially when you see something like a common hawker laying eggs on open areas of open water, by sort of dropping down and depositing eggs on the surface of the water. But a mighty hard thing is to get a good photograph of. And then a really interesting one that we get here is the common lizard. So it's our only reptile here in Northern Ireland. We don't get any snakes, obviously, as everybody's aware, or slow worms or anything else. So the common lizard is our only native reptile, and great place to see it is particularly in blanket bogs and heathlands, where lizards will very often find sort of areas of little bits of rock or a little bit of dead wood or something, where it can bask in the early morning sunshine before it starts to go about its activity of feeding. So great place to look, and great time of the year to look is actually probably in around now, where if you go up to somewhere like Slieve na Cloy, for example, in the Belfast Hills, or in and around Divis or Black Mountain, then just before it gets quite warm, the lizards are still a bit sluggish, and they go out onto these open areas to bask, and then they'll warm up, and once it gets to sort of like midday, if you come across one, it will very quickly disappear. But if you can come across them in around that early morning period, you can actually get a decent look at them before they start to disappear. But they're really, really nice species, and they actually come in really sort of strange variations of colors and patterns. Some are virgin on green, others are almost like a goldy color. And if you're very lucky, then later in the summer, you can actually come across them with babies. So really nice species, and actually the Belfast Hills is a really good spot to go looking for them. And then onto the botany then of the bogs. So many of the plants that we have, well, actually before I go on to the botany, I was just going to say there, Rushing, do we have any questions in the chat we could go through quickly?
Yeah, we do. We've got one here from Bridie, and she was saying she loves the descriptions of the bird songs. Like you were saying there about the stones banging together, and she was wondering if there was any online resources where descriptors like that can help with identification of bird song.
You told me before, actually, whenever because we did a what is it? It was a Wildlife Wednesdays, didn't we? A good one.
Yeah.
During the pandemic, about birdsong. But you had said to me there was a really good one done by the BTO.
Yeah, and I was literally Googling it there, and I'll post the link into the chat box, folks. They did a really great training course, and it'll probably come up again. Just sign up to their newsletter, and it's a couple of weeks, and I found it absolutely brilliant. And it's exactly like Simon was describing there. When you're out and about, some of the little indicators of what the different species are, and then they give us a whole raft of different resources as well that we can keep it going ourselves, like apps on your phone and that as well when you're out and about. So I'm going to try and find those links and post them in there, but I would definitely also check out on the Ulster Wildlife YouTube channel for the series of ones that Simon did, because there was a couple in there that BTO didn't cover, and it's a really, really good resource too. So I'll post the link to it in as well, Simon.
Very good. And then, was there any other questions in there?
No, just Robert was saying that he had seen a common hawker at, what's that? Quoyle River?
Yeah, somewhere like the Coyle would be a very, very good spot for common hawkers. They're quite a sort of tolerant species and more widespread. So you'll get them on bogs, but you'll also get them on quite slow flowing rivers and areas and fens. So somewhere like the Coyle is actually a really good spot for seeing quite a lot of dragonflies, to be fair. But yeah, okay, grand. Well, then we will go on to the botany then and talk about some of the plants of the peatlands. So as I've mentioned already a couple of times, they're a pretty harsh place for plants to survive. The water in it is usually very acidic. The soil, the peat itself, has very, very little nutrients in it, so you have to be pretty hardy in order to actually get by. Some of the plants in these habitats have actually evolved to find their nutrients from insects rather than the soil because of this. So we do actually have insectivorous plants here. A lot of people think that you only get insectivorous plants in the far-flung corners of Indonesia or South America or something, but we actually have several here in Northern Ireland that actually eat things like flies because they can't get the nutrients that they need out of the soil. And then there's lots of folklore and culture and history around many of the plants found on the bog. Obviously, in Northern Ireland and Ireland in general, we have quite a strong cultural tie to bogs because of things like turf cutting in the past. So there's a lot of stories and folklore which has developed over the years, over generations, with numerous plants that we find on there. And I'll mention some of those in a wee minute. Here we are. So the key plant when it comes to peatlands is sphagnum moss. So sphagnum moss is known as the bog builder, and it's known as that because it's the key plant which will form peat itself. So it forms these carpets in very waterlogged conditions, and it grows at its head. So if you think of it in a layer like this, those heads that are in the picture there, it grows up the way, but at the base, it dies at its feet. So as the years go on, it builds up these layer upon layer upon layer of dead plant material. And because of the acidic conditions, and actually because of chemicals that sphagnum moss produces, and because it's waterlogged, that plant material doesn't rot. And gradually, at about 1 millimeter a year, then we get peat forming. Now, that's a fairly slow process, and it means then that about a meter of peat takes about 1,000 years then to form, which means then that quite a few of the peatlands that we have here in Northern Ireland, they've been forming over the course of about 10,000 years, which is quite a while. But that means that sort of links back to something we've touched on in other talks, is why peatlands are such an important carbon store. So all of that locked away organic matter, which isn't rotting, which isn't going anywhere at all, is kept in the bog. That is carbon, and it means that it's not being released into the atmosphere. So sphagnum moss is really key. This is quite a rare species, actually, called sphagnum pulchrum, or golden bog moss, which I actually saw some of today out in the bog near Fintna. And we're quite lucky to have in some of our special areas of conservation across Northern Ireland, along with a few other rare sphagnum species that you don't find very commonly in places like GB, but we actually have in relative abundance here. And touching on some important but quite rare species that are very, very old. Club mosses are an ancient type of plant, which are actually more related to tree ferns, which would have been around in around the time of the dinosaurs. And these are the last remnants that we still have hanging around on here. So on the right-hand side, we've got fir club moss, which is one of the more common species. And when I say common, it's still not particularly common, but you're maybe a bit more likely to see it. And it is really restricted to some of our really upland areas. So some of our upland heaths and our montane heaths, you get fir club moss growing in amongst the heather out of the shallow peaty soils. So if you go to places like Cuckoo or the Mourne Mountains, on top of places like Sleet Donard, you're probably quite likely to see some fir club moss. And then the left is a really weird species of club moss called Marsh club moss. And actually the only place in the whole of Ireland and GB, or no, sorry, the whole of Ireland anyway, that it is found is at Peatlands Park in one little area, which is probably only about 50 yards square. And that's the only place in the whole island where this is found. And it's probably a remnant from after the last ice age, because it's a very picky plant. It needs an area of peat which is irregularly flooded to a shallow level and then regularly disturbed. So God knows how on earth it ever survived in the past. Probably in places where there was, I don't know, woolly mammoths or large elk or something that were regularly kicking over the soil and creating these nice open patches that then would have flooded with snow melt and that sort of thing. God knows. But it's managing to hang on in this tiny little corner of Peatlands Park. So really impressive that it's still there, and fingers crossed it'll stay there for another wee while. And then two plants which have a lot of folklore attached to them. On the left we have bog bean, and then on the right we have bog asphodel. So bog bean usually found in very, very wet areas of the bog, so in and around the kind of the sphagnum pools and the bog pools. You get this three-leaved, quite waxy, sort of rubbery leaves that grow out, and then in the summertime, sort of late spring, summertime, produces these really nice tall white and pink flowers that actually smell really nice as well. And bog bean has a bit of a strange history to it in that it's been regularly used by local people to create bog bean tonic or bog bean wine, which I have on good authority tastes absolutely horrendous. But it is meant to be really good for cleaning the blood. So I don't know whether this is just an association of whereby somebody says, oh, it tastes absolutely terrible, it must be good for you in some way, shape or form, which to me sounds like it's probably right. But there's still people actually making this. So I have said to a farmer out in near Drumquin that next time he is making some of this, that he's to give me some, because despite anybody telling me that it tastes absolutely horrible, I'm determined to actually give it a go at some stage, because I want to see how horrible it is. But they said it's kind of almost got like a texture of slightly watery, like treacle. but it's incredibly bitter. So yeah, it sounds absolutely terrible. But bog asphodel is another plant, produces these really nice bright yellow flowers in the summertime, again found in some of the wetter areas of the bog. And it can form these really big extensive carpets, which produce these amazing big blooms of yellow across the bog. But its Latin name is actually ossifragum, which means brittle bones. And it's called that because actually there's a lot of folklore associated with bog asphodel that says that it causes particularly sheep and cattle's bones to become very brittle and to break very easily. And now they thought for a good while that this was probably just an old wives' tale, and it was actually more related to the fact that the ground where bog asphodel grows is usually pretty terrible grazing ground, and therefore then livestock was more likely to have issues with its bones. But actually they have found in recent years that there is some sort of chemical within it which causes animals' bones. It prevents livestock from absorbing as much calcium, which means then obviously that their bones can be more brittle. So a really strange thing. One plant there on one side which has been used for generations in order to clean the blood, and then another one which has been a detriment and a bit of a scorn to farmers on bog areas throughout Ireland for generations. Very interesting. And one which is widely seen and widely known is bog cotton. And it's not that widely known. We actually have two types of bog cotton. So in the big picture in the top there, and then one in the bottom left, we have mainly cotton grass or bog cotton just as it is. And then the one in the bottom right is actually hare's tail cotton grass. And the big way to tell them apart is the bog cotton, ordinary bog cotton, has many bits of cotton, which is actually the flower of a sedge, which is what it is. It's actually not a grass at all, it's a sedge. But bog cotton has many bits of fluff or of cottony stuff coming off one stem, whereas hare's tail cotton grass just has a single pom-pom sitting on the end of a stem, which you can understand why it gets called hare's tail cotton grass, because as you can see, it looks very like a little, actually probably more like a rabbit's tail than a hare's tail, but we'll not be picky. But really iconic species of our bogs, and found basically all across peatlands, from fens through to raised bogs, all the way up into our blanket bogs. And coming into this time of year actually is when the bog cotton starts to flower, and you can get these amazing big swathes of it in places like Ballinahone here, which is the top photograph. But yeah, it was used on occasion actually as a substitute for proper cotton in some cases in the past. But as you can imagine, it's definitely not anywhere near as handy to collect in large quantities. So it was never particularly viable. Definitely a different story walking through that kind of landscape, picking cotton, compared to a nice sort of arid place in the south of the United States. But a really iconic plant of the bogs. And then one of our insectivorous plants then is the sundew, which is kind of the closest thing that we would have to a Venus flytrap. So sundews come in a couple of different forms. We have the round leaf sundew, which is the one on the left. And then we have the oblong leaved sundew, which is a bit more rare, which has sort of long, straight leaves. And on each of these little bits of the plant, it has a sort of a saucer shape, and then it has these little red hairs that come off. But on each of these hairs, it has little globules of a really sticky glue-like substance that it produces. And basically what it does is it lets flies and other insects land on those. The flies then get stuck, they can't get off. And then the little red hairs kind of pull them inwards, kind of brings them into the center of the flower head. And it then exudes digestive juices to break the fly down, and then it absorbs all the nutrients from the fly. So not the nicest way to go if you're an insect. I can think of much better ways that I would like to die, but it's incredible that we have insectivorous plants on our bogs. And actually, they're not particularly rare. Sundews, particularly like the round leaf sundew, is quite common on a lot of our peatlands, and you'll see it in amongst the sphagnum moss and some of the open areas. And it's really quite small. It's only maybe about 1 inch to 2 inches tall whenever you find it. So if you get a good sort of chance to look around in amongst the heather and the other plants in the understory, and it sticks out like a sore thumb, really. You can see all the little sticky globules hanging off it. It's amazing to find. It's such a nice plant to really get down and look at in detail. So yeah, really, really beautiful. And finally then, folks, so I've come to the end. I've taken up 40 odd minutes of your time. I just wanted to finish off by to mention some of the places that you can go and see some peatland wildlife. So there's a whole variety of different places across Northern Ireland. And I just wanted to mention some Ulster Wildlife Nature Reserves first and foremost. So Slieve na Cloy in the Belfast Hills is a really great place, which has a good mix of grassland habitats, but then also bits of blanket bog and wet heath and dry heath in some of the higher areas of the mountain. A really good place to go and see things like common lizards and stone chats, weed ears, those sorts of species. Ballyhone Bog is a beautiful site. It doesn't have sort of formal public access, but if you ask, then you can go on. And it's one of the best lowland raised bogs in Northern Ireland. 200 odd hectares, and we've done lots of restoration work on it over the years. Really good population of large heath on it too. Peatlands Park is probably the best lowland raised bog area with great access that you could go to in the whole of the country. So just off the M1 down there, kind of in between Craigavon and Dungannon, and near Loughgall, and loads of walking trails. It's got a bog garden. It's got some really good peatland. It's got some recovering peatland. It's got some issues with rhododendron and other things, but we're working hard to try and remedy those. But a great place to get really up close to a lot of peatland wildlife. Cuckoo is a great place down in Fermanagh to be able to go and see probably some of the best blanket bog that you can see in the whole island of Ireland. And you get a rare chance there to maybe see something like a hen harrier or a red grouse or even a golden plover if you're really lucky. The Mourns, very popular destination for going to see, for going walking, but one of our biggest sort of peatland resources in Northern Ireland. The only trouble I find sometimes with the Mourns is that because they're so popular, then wildlife is a little bit more scarce. But still a great place to see some of the insects and some of the sort of more common species that you can find on peatlands. Bracken Bog is a good site in County Armagh, actually, of a kind of a mix of a fen bog, lowland raised bog area, which has lots of nice walking trails around it. Rathlin Island, I have to mention because I know it very well, and it's a great spot, particularly out in the west, where you've got Kebble Nature Reserve, an NIEA site, and it's got lots of good areas of blanket bog and lots of pool systems. Great place to see bird species like weed ears and stone chats again, and maybe even if you're lucky, hen harriers too. And Lochnavar Forest, a great spot, particularly for insects, out in County Fermanagh in the west. Glendon, another Ulster Wildlife Trust Reserve in County Antrim. And then lastly there, another one, Altakira, in kind of near Limavady direction, kind of up that near Castle Rock even, direction, that part of the world. It's a national nature reserve, and it's a great piece of blanket bog area that you can drive right up to and get a good view out over that North Antrim area. But it's great to see species like emperor moths and common lizards as well. So there's lots of places that you can go, and that's not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. There's probably plenty of other places that other folks here know very well, that are closer to home. But I just thought I would throw a few in there, just to give anybody any ideas. And that is the end of the talk. So just wanted to go over a few things here before we go to some questions. So that's actually the last winter talk that we have in our series. The winter talks will be back next year. For all upcoming talks that Ulster Wildlife has on, you can go to our website, so ulsterwildlife.org/events, and check on there. They have a good sort of roster of what particularly online kind of talks we have on, but also actual, remember, real life events too that we used to do before the pandemic, where you could go out and actually see people and see stuff in the flesh. And if you're interested in becoming an Ulster Wildlife member, then you can visit our website again, look at the section there on membership or volunteering. Actually, particularly, that's something we really encourage anybody that's interested to do, and that's any area of the country. If you're interested in volunteering, please get in touch with us. And definitely, just, I'm sure a lot of you already do, but follow us on social media. So we've got profiles there on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. So if you don't already, then make sure to follow us there for good updates on all the work that we're doing. So I think then I can see the chat box going quite heftily there, but I don't know whether or not it's questions or what. But
Yeah,
get into them.
quite a few questions coming in now, Simon. So,
Grand.
Anne and Alistair are wondering, can you recommend any fens in County Down with access?
Fens in County Down with access. Fens, by their nature, are fairly dangerous places. So there's not a lot of places that do have access. So I know a lot of the Kale fens are all in private ground, and actually they're quite hard to get around because fens compared to raised bogs tend to have quite deep water in many areas of them. So I don't know of many areas in County Down, to be honest. There maybe is a bit in and around the Coil, which is probably good fen habitat, but again, access to it might be a wee bit sort of challenging. But not too far away from areas in County Down, Brackabog is actually an amazing, loads of bits of fen. Brackabog's an interesting place because it's an area where they cut peat, they cut turf, and they actually took so much turf off that they got down into the fen peat at the very bottom. And there's lots of good access trails there. I'm not 100% sure. I can't actually remember exactly where Brackabog is, but it's in Armagh, and it wouldn't be a million miles away from most places in County Down. So that might be a good alternative to take a look at if you're looking for somewhere with good access. Apologies, but yeah, sorry, Alistair. Fens they're in terms of people that want to create access to them, then all they see is health and safety hazards.
Yeah. And then Audrey's wondering who should have to ask for access to Ballinahone. I'm assuming that's Andy or someone, would it be?
Yeah, there should actually be, if you go onto Ulster Wildlife's website, there's a section on nature reserves. As far as I can remember, there's a bit on that page which says if you want to get in touch, if you would like to access one of the reserves, because there's quite a few of our reserves that we're happy for people to go onto, but we would just prefer it if you got in touch with us first to let us know. So Ballinahone's one of those, Glenarm is another one. But it should be on the nature reserves page on our website, and it probably is Andy, our nature reserves manager, that you would just need to send an email to and let him know when you were going. That would be it, I think.
Yeah, and then Rona was saying, thank you, makes you realise how important peatlands are and wonder how large-scale peat cutting can still continue. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think just we've been doing a lot of restoration work in Ulster Wildlife, both on our nature reserves, but we've also been working on a lot of private ground and publicly owned areas. And it's incredible how quickly you can actually see the wildlife coming back from doing those bits of restoration work. Like, we're creating a lot of standing water, so the invertebrate and your dragonflies and your damselflies coming back is amazing, and then obviously your bird life. So absolutely, couldn't agree more. You're preaching to the choir there, Rona. And then Lorraine, I'm so sorry, this is actually directed towards me because you actually emailed me a couple of weeks ago and this is prompting me. But yeah, she's wondering about educate. She's doing her dissertation and she's doing an educational app on peatlands. She's chosen Culca, so she's wondering if there's any books or online resources on the wildlife and plants that can be found there. So we're actually in the process of doing a little species swatch for Culca. I think there's over 30 species on that, isn't there, Simon?
Yeah.
So I can definitely forward that on to you. That's a really good starting point. Trying to think where else would be a good one. Even that NI priority species website.
Yeah, the NI priority species website's quite good for finding those. And then Ulster Wildlife actually has a good page on.
Yeah.
If you Google that, we have a page dedicated to it, which is probably quite similar information to what's on this talk, but it means you don't have to listen to me. And then I'm trying to think of any other. Quite a lot of the books, like ID guides and resources, they're quite broad. In terms of species, there's not that many that are specific to peatlands. I know the Mourns also had a nice little swatch guide too, to heathland species, which was quite good.
Yeah. Then there's the National Biodiversity Data Centre. They've got a couple of really good swatches, don't they? Grand. And then Jane saying, very interesting, thank you, that she lives 2.3 miles outside Newton Ards and saw lizards in their local garden last year. That's lovely.
Oh my God, geez. Well, if you live just outside, I'm trying to think of the places you're going.
What's the closest?
Yeah, either probably somewhere fairly close to somewhere like Scrabble or White Spots or somewhere like that there, which are also very good places for lizards. But yeah, God, that's amazing getting a lizard in your garden.
Yeah.
You know?
Andy's wondering, are there any more threats to golden plover other than climate change? Are they doing badly in the south as well as Northern Ireland?
Yes, there's loads of threats to them. The
Yeah.
short answer is yes, there is loads. They definitely are at massive risk from predation. So a lot of breeding wader species, including golden plover, are at risk from particularly things like crows, but also foxes, badgers, and other corvids, ravens as well. Because of the way land management goes these days, there's a lot more of those kind of species around than there probably historically would have been. And golden plover just nest right out in the open where it's very easy to be picked off. But also habitat changes have happened quite a lot over the years. So actually, one of the problems that we found in work that we've been doing is that golden plover are actually quite happy whenever blanket bog habitat is in quite bad condition. So if you've got areas that are, say, like overgrazed, where the vegetation is very, very short, that's actually what golden plover love. So back whenever the headage payments were happening on the hills and there was thousands of sheep up on the mountains, golden plover were actually doing a bit better. But as the habitats have got slightly better, then golden plover have maybe disappeared. So it's a really complicated kind of picture. Roisin, I don't know whether you want to say it.
Yeah, I suppose the other ones would be wildfires when they're timed. They can actually happen when the birds are on their nest or the chicks have just fledged and obviously can't get away from them. So that's a big one. And I'd also say disturbance. So maybe in places like the Mournes, we also get a little bit in Culca. There's a route that goes right through the golden plover breeding area. But they'll get spooked and leave the nest, and that obviously opens it up to predation and that as well. But those would be the main ones. Like, to be fair now, when the blanket bog's in good condition, they naturally have a shorter sward when you get that really, really high quality intact pool system. And then even just from year to year, they rely a lot on crane flies when the chicks have just fledged. So that's why climate change is a big thing, because that changes in weather can change when the crane flies and that start emerging. And then if that's not synced up with the chicks emerging, that's when you get a big issue as well. But I think they're the main ones, yeah.
In terms of like how they're doing in the rest of like the Republic and all, they still have reasonable populations in places like Donegal and like North Mayo. So that's really, it's north and west is their preference, and they're just being pushed further and further north and west. So eventually, if no sort of management is done to benefit them and climate change keeps on going on the trajectory that it's going, it'll likely be that they'll hang on in like Donegal, and then eventually they would just be pushed off, Malin Head. Just got the Brian.
I think there's an estimate of less than 20 breeding pairs in Northern Ireland now. And that's probably quite out of date too.
Yeah.
So a really rare one, a nice one to see if you get a chance to. Okay, John is wondering, or saying Bracket Bog is near Portadown. Thanks to both speakers. Great, thanks very much, John. So Bracket Bog is about 3 miles south of Portadown off the Tandragee Road, managed by Armagh Craigavon Council, and there's a bit of parking. I was wondering, it felt kind of familiar. I've been on it. It's a really, really nice site. Really lovely site. That's great. That's the species spot. Yeah, I'll send that through, Lauren. Okay, so Bridget, thank you. Yeah, that's all the questions, it seems like, anyway, Simon.
Okie doke. Well, folks, unless there's any more questions on there, that's not any more coming through there, is that just? No,
we can stick on for another couple of minutes if there's anything else.
Yeah.
That seems to be it. And just when you're saying about the events, there is in-person events coming up, folks, and they're booking up quite fast. So definitely have a look on the website. It'd be nice to get out to some of the nature reserves. There's a few really interesting ones coming up.
Yeah, definitely. I know, as nice as these ones are, when we get into the good sort of weather in the spring, summer season, there's nothing really that you can replicate online, which compares to, going out and going for a walk around Slievenacloy with Andy or Ronald, or going around Balnahone with the Nature Reserves team or something like that. So definitely get a look in at them, because they're very, very good. And particularly places like Balnahone, where it isn't that handy to just go for a dander on your own. And it's always much better to go with somebody that knows the site really well, because they can tell you things that you wouldn't maybe ordinarily actually find out.
Are there any walks planned?
On peatland sites?
Yeah.
There are walks planned. I think there might be some on Slievenacloy.
Yeah.
They might be mainly grassland, but we both work on a project called CAN. And so if you check out the CAN website or Twitter, it's just the CAN project.org. We will have bog day events coming up this summer down in Cuckoo. And you'll get a chance to get out on the bog then. I'm not sure if you are doing any on any of the other lowland sites, Simon?
No.
On the plant?
Yeah, we may well do one at Peatlands Park or something if there's enough interest, which it sounds like there may well be.
Yeah, definitely. So check out the CAN website and keep an eye on the Ulster Wildlife Events page too. And if you remember, I think you get the little email update as well, and it'll have them all on. But yeah, we should definitely do one in the summer, shouldn't we, Simon?
Yeah, no, I think we should, especially now that restrictions are making it a little bit more possible, and we don't have to worry quite as much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, folks, if there are questions, that is kind of perfectly timed. I've got 2 minutes to 8 o'clock there. So unless anybody's going to throw in with any last minute curveballs, then thank you very much for coming along and listening to us chat about peatlands wildlife. And as I said before, if you want to find out any more information, then just go to our website there about events, or join in become a member or volunteer. And that's absolutely everything. So have a good evening, and hopefully we'll see you at more either in-person talks or online talks in the future.
Well, thank you very much. It was a very, very interesting talk. You're like a talking computer. It was excellent. Thank you.
Not at all, Edward. I will take that as a compliment.